Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our next installment of Lindsey Byrd in Writing is Hard. Today, our topic of discussion focuses on historical research and world building in fantasy environments set in the Georgian era. We also talk about different tropes, including fortune telling, love, and war. I hope you enjoy. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I am joined with Lisa Tirreno. Lisa lives in Melbourne, Australia, with her family and a soap opera of chickens. A self-described recovering journalist, Lisa likes museums, old Hammer horror movies, and pre-Raphaelite art. She has an honors degree in English literature and history and is good at stabbing herself with embroidery needles and making elaborate cakes for no good reason, which honestly is the only reason that I can find no good reason to be perfectly justifiable. Her debut novel, Prince of Fortune, was just released in January of this year uh, in Australia, but it was also released prior to that in the rest of the world. So now everybody has access to it, if I'm not mistaken. Um, and it is a YA fantasy. And the back of book blurb reads, Shy Prince Edmund will be a great king one day. It has been seen again and again. With rare magic giving him dominion over his country's plants and weather, Edmund feels a great deal of pressure to live up to his nation's many expectations, including making a perfect diplomatic alliance through marriage. That is until he meets Lord Aubrey Ainsley. Charming, romantic, and politically insignificant, Aubrey is a seer, but not even he could have predicted catching the eye of Edmund, the Prince of Fortune, nor that the anxious prince who talks to plants more than people could feel so right for him. Aubrey's visions have been full of battle, not love. But to say that Prince Edmund has captured his fancy would be a great understatement. As the two become more and more intertwined, the nation of Sabin falls under attack. War and dark sorcery loom on the horizon, and to save their homeland, Edmund and Aubrey must resist the outside forces seeking to drive them apart and find the power within themselves to create a future for Sabin and each other they never could have imagined. So just to start us off, your story sounds fascinating. What drew you to write this book in the first place?
It started off the very, very first, like, sort of kernel of it, started with a dream I had that was of two young men chasing each other around in a night market.
Okay.
And that scene, I kept it through every draft. I was so happy I got to keep it. It's in the final book. It's not quite the same, but like it was mainly just a dynamic. So, like, there was one who was all smiles and like impish cheekiness, and he was kind of dragging the other one around. And the other one was like really shy, and he wasn't sure he was supposed to be there, but he was just delighted that he was able to be there with the other one. And I was like, oh, well, what happens now? Yeah, I had to write it. So I had to come up with a story for them.
A question I asked someone else a week or so ago was like, what was the one scene in the book where if you think about the book, that's the scene that they think of? Would that be your scene?
That is the scene. Yeah.
What about like the presentation or the visual of the night market really helps emphasize that scene for you?
I love a night market, just personally, but I also love it when there's a night market in a fantasy book. Like, I think that that is like a thing that sometimes happens, and you either like love it or it leaves you cold. I love it when there's a night market, when there's a magic market, and it's not even a magic market. They're just magic. So, like, it isn't exactly, a goblin market where you've got to watch out because you could lose your smile or whatever. But yeah, I was just wanting it to be a place where anything could happen.
I think that's part of the, like you said, the magic of it. It doesn't have to be magical, but there is a magic in just the interaction and the night and the vibe and the feeling as you're getting through it and you see it. You can kind of really put yourself into the scene of just really the lights being just so, the sound of it. Um, when you're describing something like that, what type of details do you add in order to really make that ambiance feel realistic, but also have that heightened level of magic?
I think with something like that, everybody has an idea of what, like it should smell like fried
Yeah.
food, exotic food. It should have, beautiful things for sale. There should be crowds, and you should find things that you wouldn't see otherwise. So I think that just describing those things, it makes it real easy to use all five of your senses, which is one of the ways that you can really ground someone in the scene. So I think that an environment like that that people might have been in themselves, it makes it really easy. Yeah.
I think smell is the one that, if I remember correctly, smell and taste tend to be the ones that get dropped off the most. We tend to always write about things that you see, things that you hear, you can touch, but smell and taste are like the two senses that are often forgotten about when people are writing books, because it's just you're so used to the visual medium. But smell, I feel like I read this somewhere that a sense of smell is a very fast way to trigger a memory, where if you smell something, you're immediately transported someplace. And so it's always like something I've always been cognizant of, at least, is just make sure you put the smell in because it's always like forgotten about.
Well, one of my characters is obsessed with food, so talking
Oh,
about the taste of things was really easy.
what
I
was
had
it?
one I had one beta reader who asked, "But what's the point of all the food? Why are there so many descriptions of food?" And I'm like, "You're not my reader." Um,
I don't know. I feel like I've just been raised on so many Ghibli films that the sight of food just makes me go, yes. So I love food in book. What it would be this character's favorite dish? Like if he had to prepare something or if he had to, share a meal with somebody, what would be the dish that he would want to go with?
oh, it'd be some sort of cake.
Is that a little bit of you coming through?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. He wouldn't have made the cake.
No, but you can appreciate a good cake. There's good cake out there.
Mhm.
A lot of the summary of the book describes fortune telling, seeing into the future. Even in the title, Prince of Fortune. What was or I should say, what was the particular mechanism of using fortune telling that was so fascinating for you as a writer, but also within the story itself?
Well, once I worked out that one of my characters was going to be a prince, then you're already talking about destiny and expectations. Like there's already those expectations put on that person. You have been born into this, you have a specific destiny already. And so for a fantasy novel, that just makes a logical leap for there to be actual prophecy. So that kind of, flowed like that. I think that I always like it because it's very clear when there's prophecies and they're true and real and people believe them. Well, that makes it a fantasy novel. Like that it's not going to be any other genre if it's got that kind of thing. But like it's a classic for a reason. But I think also it is in our older stories, like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, they have, vision dreams, and it's in a lot of ancient myths. And I think we have a real urge as humans to understand things and to wish that we knew what was going to happen so we could make better decisions or that, like we could plan for the outcome. Like we're a species that plans. So I think that that just comes naturally from our yearning for understanding and knowledge. So that always feels to me like something very true, even though it's a fantasy genre, um, it's a trope. So yeah.
It is a trope, but you also brought up how the trope can be different depending on the author, depending on the reader expectations. Like, for instance, you could have hard and fast rules saying this is the future, you cannot change it, it is going to be what it's going to be. Or, as you mentioned, can you change that future? If you know it, you can make a different choice and that future doesn't come to pass. For your book, where are your rules on how that fortune is settled?
Well, you ruin the tension if you
Right.
have very clear things that are definitely going to happen in a book, so you can't do that. But it's always really easy because again, it's a trope for a reason. In this world, what happens? in those vision dreams or in however other ways that the seers are seeing what they're seeing, it always happens. But they're usually a bit vague on the details. And it's one of the things that Aubrey hates about his vision dreams. Like they really annoy him. And he will often have the same ones. And like he wakes up feeling a bit sick and crappy, and he's like, "Well, what was even the point of that? Like, what did I have that for? That gave me no information whatsoever." But then I had to kind of think about, well, what if you had a world where that was the case, where you knew certain things were going to happen? You had certain bits of the future, and I kind of had to go, well, all right, you would probably use those to influence things like government policy. But then the bad side to that would be that that would get over relied on, and if you then chose not to act because, well, that hasn't been seen, then that can be very frustrating as well. And that is what Edmund finds very frustrating about the way that the country deals with, these prophecies that they've got.
His name, I mean, he's called the Prince of Fortune. That's a lot of expectation to put on somebody, especially with all of, the possibilities there. Do we see his reaction to being called that? And if you can, and it's not a spoiler, how does he deal with being given such a title?
It's not a spoiler, it's right there in the name. But to explain, that is the title of a particular person in their world who has the kind of magic that he does. So the royal family are largely the only people that have magic or people that are related to them because of historical reasons. And whoever has the most magic is made the next king. He made it clear from a very young age that he had this specific Prince of Fortune magic, which is weather magic and plant cultivation magic, so he can make the crops grow. He can calm down a storm or make it rain. He can control the winds to push the ships. So he has this very specific, very rare sort of magic when normally the royal family's magic is just purely elemental. And because he has this magic, he was immediately declared the next king at a very young age. He didn't even remember when normally the magic might come a bit later on in the child's life. And that's the title you get, partly because you will bring, new greatness to your country, but also because they tend to come at times when the country needs them. But again, do they come at times when the country needs them, or do they get thrust into that? And so that kind of question is really one that gets explored, but which also he is just so crushed under the weight of all of these expectations. And some of them are prophesized, and some of them are just expectations that, you get put into particular roles and paths that might not even suit you just because of circumstances and how frustrating that can be. And I think that that is also something that queer people understand. So, like, I felt like that was a natural extension of the story I was trying to tell.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, like, is that something that the country really needs, or is that just the narrative, shall we say? Because there's a bit of confirmation bias you could have with that, where it's like, oh, we have this ability, so now we can, we can fix this problem that we've been ignoring all this time. But look, the magic has arrived. We can now fix it. Isn't that wonderful? The country goes forward. That can be really challenging for somebody growing up. You're like, here's your expectations. You have plant magic. Go make sure the country does not starve.
And I mean, he does that, and he's perfectly happy to do that. But there's a downside to that as well. And again, now we've hit spoilers. I can't tell you
That's fine.
uh, why that is relevant to the story, but yeah, yeah.
No, I'm just commenting on just it's a great tension. Like even just from that little bit, you can really feel the tension in the novel and see where it's going to be going. Um, some of the other themes that are very evident in the backup book blurb is the dichotomy between love and war. We both are pretty common tropes as well, but it seems like they're particularly unique here in just how the futures are being shown, his expectations of finding a desirable match, but his seer, who he's growing close to, is foreseeing only war. How did you balance both of those within your book?
I, to be honest, didn't want to balance both of those. I wanted this to be very clearly supposed to be a love story that gets interrupted by war. The war was interrupting what was supposed to be happening. And the country was not supposed to have to put up with this. The country was doing its thing, and this thing got imposed upon them that shouldn't have been happening. And it interrupts the love story and it interrupts everything. And so I was not terribly interested in balance, as you say, with that. I wanted it to be shocking and gory and uh, very sharp in the way that it imposed itself on the story that was being told. Yeah.
I think a lot of people who are experiencing their own love stories, there are moments where suddenly something interrupts that love story and makes it so that everything that was beautiful is now stopped. There's a lot of grief in that. There's a lot of uncertainty in that. What type of emotions were you really tapping into when you got to this interruption?
Well, I think that I don't think I've been subtle in the metaphor that I'm trying to draw, in that this is the kind of thing that queer people experience all the time. Discussion over whether they should be able to marry the one that they love, that was a constant in my growing up. The idea that you're just trying to do your thing, but instead there's a war going on and you're getting pulled into it is something that I assume is going to feel familiar for a lot of people. So,
A lot of different metaphors for different things going on at any given moment. When we first started the conversation about having this interview, you'd mentioned you'd done a lot of research, and that the Prince of Fortune is loosely set in the Georgian era. Can you tell us more about what that type of research looked like?
well, I ended up having to find all sorts of weird details about what got invented when. And look, even just the names of things and sorting out etymology, because sometimes a particular thing would reference an inventor, and you can't put that person in a fantasy novel. That person didn't exist, so you had to kind of, I ended up down so many rabbit holes, and I remembered I was poring over old digitized newspapers, looking at uh, stories about bone setting, because sometimes there would be dramatic incidents where people would be injured in the street and then the bone setter would come and everyone was excited and like would watch them at work like it was theatre because they didn't have TV yet. And usually if you broke a leg, unless there was a really good bone setter around and some strong men to rip the leg back into place, you usually had to have your leg amputated because the thigh muscles are so strong, they contract and it's all over. And even if they can set the bone, like without modern techniques, you usually just would lose your leg. So I ended up reading so much about that and about then these machines turned up and I had to work out whether or not they would have these traction contraptions that pulled the limb straight. And they ended up going, yeah, I reckon they did. And then I had to find out like they had ether already, but they didn't use it medically. And so, like, you would often just drink a bottle of brandy and pass out drunk, which is not good when you've got a broken limb. So, like, I had to research a whole lot of detail about that kind of thing. Um, but I also found a lot of the time, what I needed was the vibe. Like I just needed vibes. Because you're writing fiction, you just need vibes. And if you do too much historical research, it starts being ridiculous and you're getting down in the weeds. But you also end up coming across the Tiffany problem. You know, the Tiffany problem. The Tiffany problem is when something is completely historically accurate, but modern audiences are going to think that it's ridiculous and it's going to pull them out of the story. So, like, the name Tiffany was a medieval name, but if you had Lady Tiffany in, the 1300s or whatever, people would be like, "What?" and they would hate that. Just like nipple rings in the Victorian era were a thing. No, you cannot do that usually. Like it would be like, what is happening here? So just stuff like that. So you need vibes. I also found that what the newspapers were helpful for were also the wording and the way that the writing was. Like I also ended up like rereading Austen just to try and get the wording right and the very long sentences, although my editor made me, shorten a lot of them, but like that kind of thing helps with the voice of a story. So when you're writing something historical, even if it's fantasy, you still need to balance a whole lot of stuff. And you still need to make it so that like it's a YA novel. Teenagers need to be able to understand it. They're not all going to have, read Pride and Prejudice or whatever and understand what some of this vocabulary is or what, that particular sentence phrasing is. And I had, again, my editor went through a lot and said, nah, it feels awkward, even though like that is how it would have been phrased, 250 years ago. So yeah, there's a lot of balancing there.
Well, it's almost an act of translation because you are taking something from a particular period, but you're bringing it to a modern audience who needs to be able to connect with it. So finding the wording, finding the way of conveying the same thoughts and feelings and themes without necessarily using the exact same way it would have been written all those years ago. What would you find? What was your favorite weird thing that you found while you were doing your research?
Oh, uh, let me have a think. Human hair was used to decorate clothes sometimes. That I think was my favorite weird thing. I actually went to an exhibition of historical fashion. And there was this capelet, like a woman's capelet that only went down to the waist, I think. But all around the edge, it was fringed with a literal fringe. Like it had a fringe of human hair all the way around it in this pale gold, like a blonde woman had sold her hair to make this cape.
Fascinating. I'm trying to imagine it and also just the circumstances around it, like how'd they get the hair, like following that rabbit hole. Like that's such a fascinating, um, I bet that was expensive too.
I assume so, yeah. Even just being able to sew it in.
Oh yeah,
Like,
exactly. Like because
yeah.
it's very fine. How did you press it or what was the method of creation? That is a weird thing. How did you end up finding that?
It was on exhibition at the museum that I went to. So it's this touring exhibition of like Austen era clothes.
Okay.
And I learned fascinating things that I had not seen anywhere else. And I had like looked at books, I'd looked at historic, book plates, but like it never covers things like the fact that men had pockets in the tails of their coats. So they'd have a tailcoat, just the same as like a tuxedo sometimes has, tails at the back now. There would be pockets in the bottom of the tailcoat, but they were tailored so that the jacket would still hang beautifully. Like we don't think about putting pockets weird places like that.
I suppose it makes sense though, because I mean, like tailcoats are kind of cut a little bit high up, and so if you needed to put something somewhere, whether that's your wallet or whatever the equivalent would be, like you'd need to have something.
Yeah.
But you're right, I never would have considered that being the place. Although I imagine it helps with the silhouette a little bit more depending on what you've put back there. Who knows? Um, What would you recommend for people who are interested in writing in this type of time period? Like, where should they start? Where should they start looking into doing research, or what type of things should they be turning to?
I over research, so I don't know if I should be telling anyone how to do that. I end up down rabbit holes. I waste a lot of time. Really, I ended up researching all sorts of stuff about highwaymen for a scene that had a highwayman in the very first draft that got deleted. Like it was all pointless. I don't know if I should be asking anyone, but a general history I think is a good place to start if you know your time period. If you read a really general history or even the Wikipedia page. Like for me, I knew to go straight to, we have a resource at our libraries called Trove that is a whole lot of historical stuff. So I had used that at university. I knew how to research using that. And also I was probably procrastinating a bit by going to primary sources for no reason. But I think a good place to start is a really general sort of history. I ended up to try and work out how I was going to organize my military. It was too much information going to primary sources. It was too much information even going through books. And I ended up just looking at encyclopedias to try and work out what it was like then, what it was like in various other European countries, what I wanted to do as well. Like you need to make decisions based on that research that you've done and work out what you're going to name, what rank, how many ranks there's going to be, what happens there. Are there sub ranks? How many people are there per company? Like you need to decide all sorts of things when you're going to do a war story that you need really nitty gritty kind of stuff. And I needed to start somewhere very basic. So yeah.
As a historian in my real life job, I will push back ever so slightly just to say that all of the history that anybody does any research on, it all will help inform something in the future. You never know. Something in the future, you might say, that highwayman that I did that research on, that sounds like something I'm going to work on for the next idea. You never know when things might come in. No history research is bad history research unless it's done poorly. Um,
I'll put Highwayman in something. I liked him.
Well, I mean, they're just so exciting. I mean, like, there's the tension, there's the surprise, there's, the attitude, what got him involved with it. But now you know the backstory, you know how Highwayman kind of got started or got involved. Like, I feel like when you're doing research, it might not necessarily end up in the book, but it helps inform your characters on the world that they perceive and they know it. And even if it's a subtle thing where maybe there's a line where they don't go out in this particular area because there might be highwaymen, and you don't need to necessarily put that on the page, but it helps inform those characters' decisions in other ways where subtly as the author, you're more aware of the world, and so it makes it a little bit more believable while you're actually writing.
I learned a lot about highways. So
And the different pros and cons and interconnectivity and the rise of globalization, if you want to call that, as it slowly starts connecting more towns and more trade. And there's a lot to be said about a good highway and a good highwayman. You never know. Um, Within all of this research, once you've actually done the work, you've done the reading, you've um, created either notebooks or whatever it is to help you remember it all. When you actually sit down to write it, how do you massage those details into the actual world building so that when you're writing it, it comes off as believable?
uh well you use the magic word there, which is details. And I think that it's the details that sell something. So I think that sometimes vibes is all you need. But you really do need the details of like what the shirt is made of. You need the details of what plants are in the garden. You need uh, one of the things that I found that was so great was and it wasn't a historic resource. It was made by a historian who was just obsessed with the like with Austen reenacting, and it was an Austen cookbook, and it was all these recipes, and it gave you an idea not just of the food and how it was prepared. Like it just took forever. Often, like the servants just took forever and ever. There were a lot of aspects, but also an idea of what was served for each meal and how much food was put on the table. And then I ended up having to find out for royalty how much food got put on the table. And just the idea that there was all this excessive food, and that was partly because then once the family were done or whatever, it then went to the kitchen. It fed all the servants as well. So, like, it wasn't just going to waste, it was to excess for a reason because it wasn't just for the family to eat. And what foods were there. I had to research. what was in season. And I'm from being from Australia, we have a very mild climate. It never occurred to me to even think about the fact that growing lemons in England was a problem. And then I was like, oh my, like what else have I put in there that would have actually been an imported food? And and I had to make sure everything was in season and that kind of thing. I don't know if readers are going to notice that I made sure everything was in season, but I think that a few times I mentioned that something was about to go out of season. And so, like, to make it obvious that you're in the palace and they've got the best of everything, um, that kind of thing is all just massaging to help, I think, make it feel real. Um,
I think the reality is such an important part because we're all aware it's a fantasy book. Like when you're reading the book, you know it's fantasy, you know that doesn't necessarily have to be real. But the way I think readers can connect to that is imagining it's real and feeling as if, you know what, this could happen somewhere in another universe where magic exists. Um, but were there ever moments while you were writing where you had a historical thing, you knew the historical thing was a certain way, and you're like, you know what, for the vibes, for the aesthetic, I'm just gonna slightly change it into something else?
Well, it's not an accurate representation of late Georgian era. It is definitely a fantasy. And I mean, one of the starting points of the story was that I wanted to create a world where there was no homophobia, there's no transphobia, the sexism is dialed way down. I couldn't quite get rid of all of it. Um, Partly because of where they are medically. But yeah, no, there was so many changes. Then once you make a certain set of decisions, a whole lot of other decisions happen. There's a whole lot of flow-on effects to what you're doing. And so it's a world without religion, and I had to think about how that would impact the sciences and medicine. And it's a world where all of the countries on the continent are locked into a very strict peace treaty, and if they've had stability this whole time, what that means for trade, what that means for them turning up for each other when they are actually having military conflict, what that means for colonization. I decided there wouldn't be any colonization because they're not competing with each other, so they don't need to go and steal resources from somewhere else, so they can carry on making wars. A lot of the ships in the famous British Navy were made from Tasmanian trees. So, like, there were very real reasons why colonization was happening that had to do with them competing in Europe against each other. If you're not doing that, then there's flow-on effects for all sorts of things. So, like, you make a few decisions, then suddenly you have to think about the ramifications of all of them.
It's a bit like doing an alternate history. I mean, yes, it's a fantasy, but following those trains of
Hmm.
thoughts where that ripple effect definitely would take place. I mean, while you were talking, I was just imagining like if there was no religion, that was prohibiting certain types of medical research, a lot of things would have been quite different. Just from the general idea of what you can do with the body. I mean, this is my bailiwick. 'Cause I'm the historian of medicine, but like just the idea you were prohibited from ever touching the body after it died because it was, you know, that was that. And so people would steal bodies in the middle of the night in order to do their medical research to like figure out where's the organ, what is this, what is that. If you didn't have that type of prohibition and people were like, yeah, you could take the body, whatever, you could have a lot more of that scientific inquiry prior to when things were actually happening, at least as far as England medical care is concerned. Other countries were doing much better in that regard.
Well, that's the thing. And in a lot of ways, I still wanted to acknowledge that. And I have a country that is the equivalent of a Middle East or a North African nation. And just knowing that Egypt had a perfectly functional hospital while most of Europe was still, you know, like I think that Spain was still under the Spanish Inquisition. And meanwhile, Egypt has, this great hospital going. I ended up deciding that that particular country would have the best doctors. And so the royal family, I gave them an imported doctor from there just because they would have the best as the royal family. And then that becomes a point of contention because why should they um, have anything better than anyone else? Why wasn't this being shared with everyone? Because of the class system. But I put in people who wanted to revolutionize the class system. So you again, if you create a world that is more equal, you're going to find people who want to make it even more equal and still want to continue to improve it. So yeah, you just end up you end up running in all directions, and also as much as we say that would definitely impact medicine, what also impacted medicine was the level of technology. And if there's not all of this stolen wealth from colonization, I ended up having to decide that the Industrial Revolution would have been slower and later. So, it ended up swinging and roundabouting a lot. Um,
Yeah, but I think that really speaks to the level of research that you did. Like, if you hadn't done all the research, you wouldn't have had as thorough of an understanding of where you could make those changes or what was influencing those changes. So I know you were saying you may have over-researched, but it sounds like the world you created was genuinely, it was very well thought out because of the research that you did.
mm, maybe just a bit too thought out.
I don't know. We'll leave that to the readers to decide. What was your favorite part about building this world?
I have to say that it would be one thing. I love a story with a map in the front.
Yeah.
And even though my map was terrible, I desperately needed it because I needed to work out travel times and I needed to make sure that I kept track of where things were. There's even one point where one of my characters has to walk a long distance, and I needed to make sure that when he hit the coast, he turned the right way. Like I needed to make sure when he exited the mountain range, he went the right way. So, just stuff like that. I needed my map. And I was all ready to fight for the map when I had my call with my editor, but it was the first thing that she said, so it was fine. And then, but I have to also say that that was probably also the most challenging part because I had created this whole country and all of these cities, needed to be in there because of, various plot reasons. Keeping track of it all was really quite hard. So, yeah.
How early in the process did you have at least somewhat of a functional map, even if it wasn't like the most beautiful map?
I think I was about a quarter of the way into the first draft, and I was like, okay, we've already got three locations, and I know there's going to be more. I just started jotting things down on the back of an envelope.
What type of method did you use for your map? Did you just like draw a circle at first and then just put things down? Did you do the rice method or people trace over rice? How did you
Oh
develop
no,
your
no,
map?
no, no! It was nowhere near that quality. Yeah, so I had to work out because but I also had like I already had this idea that uh, uh, the country had split in half 500 years earlier, and they're a peninsula. And so one bit of the peninsula up top is divided from the rest by a mountain range. And there's an old story about Queen Helen the First raised that mountain range to protect them from the people that wanted to leave. And then the mountain range had to join them to the rest of the continent. And then I had to work out where exactly the other countries were, even though I didn't really need a lot of detail. But then I worked out that there needed to be a river in between two of them. So then I needed to work out how a river works geographically if there's a mountain range. And I had to work out like how if you were on a peninsula, where the crossing points would be so that you could travel from the mainland. And I needed them plot wise to be in specific points. So then I had to create geography that would impede it being anywhere else. And then I had to work out how a rough sea works geographically to make it difficult for the island nations to the north to travel. They have to go all the way around because there were all of these things, and I had no idea, like in terms of science, how any of those geographical features would impact the landscape. I had to work all that out. And I'm like, why do I have to do this? Just make it up. And I'm like, no, no, we have to work out how it works. It needs to make sense. So yeah.
Honestly, I love that level of detail in a book. I do. I'm that person that's just like, oh, the mountains, and I start getting into it. And so I would be that reader who would genuinely appreciate all of that. I know some readers m might just be like, mountain, cool, turn the page, but at least one person, I'm sure I'm of a large cohort, would really appreciate it because it's just, it's so important actually when you think about it. Like, what do the mountains mean for how the culture evolves? Like you said, the idea of they were purposely brought up to separate us. What does that inform for the people who are living at the foot of the mountain? What does that inform for like the type of people who are farming, who are working the rivers nearby? Like what type of landscape or villages come out of that? What type of trade would start because of it? Like all of that is very geographically based and geologically based, depending on even the type of construction of houses when it comes to mining, when it comes to, these are the types of trees that are here because of the wind. This is like it's so interconnected and it gets so exciting when you're reading it. It's like, ah, yes.
Microclimates.
Yes, absolutely. I was just visiting my sister in California earlier this year, and she lives up in the mountains. And depending on where on the mountains you were, it was either um, I'll do it in Fahrenheit. It was either 20, 30 degrees, snowing all the time, or it was 50 degrees and perfectly sunny, and everything was, lovely weather you could just go and walk around in. Um, it really depends where you are and how that would affect your quality of life and also how your villages or how your interactions with other people will be. So never discount how much the map, but also how much the physical mountains, etc., means to the story.
Well, the other thing, much as with the lemons, Australia is the flattest continent. We're very flat. We don't really have mountains. We don't really do mountains. And so the kind of weather that happens in mountains, like as you say, like high weather, you're more likely to get in high locations, you're more likely to get snow. We have very little snow in Australia, and it's not just because we're warmer, it is also because we're so low. So like I think that I want to say it's Perth is at zero. Like it is at 0 meters above sea level. So like we're very, very flat. So mountains to me are magic anyway. So to make a magic mountain just seemed quite reasonable to me. But then I had to work out how mountains work.
Yeah, the altitude absolutely makes a difference. And also for like breathing, because the air is so much thinner. If you For anybody who's curious, there is actually an issue when you live in mountains and you're a tourist and you move to a place for a short period of time to have fun. And if you drink a lot of alcohol, you have a tendency to end up getting drunk much faster because of the way that it's absorbing into your bloodstream. And so there's actually a lot of issues when tourists come into high altitude places because they are not used to the effects of what might happen. So fair warning for anybody who's traveling and feeling
I'm
like they
wrong.
should enjoy. Um, as we get towards the end of our discussion today, is there anything we haven't talked about that you'd like to share or any extra thoughts that you have about your book or your process?
I over researched. Don't do that, is my advice. That this has been lovely. Thank you so much for having me. I wanted to make sure to remember to thank you. So
Oh, no problem at all. I'm so happy to have you here. Thank you so much for being with us. And also, as a reminder to everybody, The Prince of Fortune is out anywhere that you would like to buy it. I will put on some links in the description, so please do follow through. And thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you again to Lisa Tirreno for joining us today in this episode of Lindsey Byrd in Writing is Hard. Lisa's book, The Prince of Fortune, is available for purchase. Check out the links in the description for more information, and if you like this content, please do like, subscribe, and share. As always, stay happy and healthy. Bye for now.